Okay, welcome back. We are looking at part 11, where did the Book of Mormon come from? We're looking at these four tests, so we're going to look at the fourth test, were they biased? So, looking at all these witnesses, did these witnesses have an ulterior motive? If they were lying about this, did they have something to gain from lying? And when you look at the family witnesses, the Kanye White Ohio witnesses, the co-worker witnesses, the loan creditor witness, the Amity witnesses, did they really have something to gain? And what a man by the name of G. Warner Wallace, a homicide detective, he usually puts this into three main ulterior motives why people lie, and that is they want to gain riches. They do it for sexual lust or illicit relationships. They do it for fame or power. Do any of these three ulterior motives fit these witnesses that we've talked about? To me, after examining all of this, I don't think they had anything to gain. But let me ask you this. Let's put it on the other side. What did Joseph Smith, what did Sidney Rigdon and others have to gain from lying? And I have to admit to you, friends, with regards to Sidney Rigdon, no doubt number three would fit with him. With Joseph Smith, definitely almost all three of them. Actually, Sidney Rigdon also number one, as we'll see. Um, but we see, when a person cross-examines affidavits made by these witnesses and the examiner finds them to be hiding something or to be deceitful in some manner, then one must examine the motive as to why these witnesses would lie in the first place concerning the statements they made. And J. Warren Wallace, being a detective for many years, proposed that many people commit a crime for the same three reasons: sexual lust, to gain fame or power or prestige, or for the love of money. And so, would the Spalding witnesses lie in order to have illicit sexual relationships? The answer would be no, because many of them, but not all, claim to believe in the what's called the Christian worldview, and that worldview established the proper rules for sexual conduct. Would the Spalding witnesses lie in order to have some kind of power and prestige? Yes, it is true that they most likely created a lot of buzz in their day when their statements were written down in books and newspaper articles and read by the masses. Yet remember that these people knew that they were committing perjury and would have to stand for God to give account of their deceitfulness. Would the Spalding witnesses lie in order to make some kind of money on the deal? And my question would be, well, how did they get rich off of it? Do we have any evidence that they gain any greater financial status for doing that? And then, like I said, let's put it on Sidney Rigdon and Solomon Spalding. Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith. If you were to look at their history, would they have any ulterior motives for lying? Knowing that at some point, according to Doctrine and Covenants 132 now, we know that Rigdon, I believe, was against the polygamy idea. But there was a time when a supposed revelation was given that sanctioned polygamy. But, of course, Joseph Smith was the prophet, right? So he had the voice of God behind him. Knowing at some point in their history that Smith was a charismatic leader and certainly gained a following, could not be said he gained power and prestige among his followers. Knowing at some point in their history that Smith was a treasure hunter and there were certain financial escapades that he could ventured upon, such as the bank in Kirtland. Remember, they created this bank there. It could not be said that he did it for financial gain. So I really think that does indeed fit with the ulterior motives for lying, and fit in the bigger picture with Rigdon and and Joseph Smith. Now, if we're looking at these other witnesses that came along, these are not as strong as the other ones. I want to put that up there. So here's what Cephas Dodd said. This is in 1857. Colonel Ringland, dear sir, it has been some time since I received your letter, but owing to bad health and other circumstances, I have not been able to reply until now. I have no knowledge on the subject which would be of any avail. Solomon Spalding came to Amity with his wife and a little daughter about 1814, as nearly as I recollect. He was accompanied by a certain Robert Collins, who was supposed to be a bachelor, and from some of the eastern states. They had little property and rented a tavern and kept a public house. After some months, Collins left for parts unknown. He so represented himself, but it was reported that he had left a wife in New England. Mr. and Mrs. Spalding usually attended church one part of a day. I understood from him that he had formerly lived at Cherry Valley in the state of New York, where he had met with some losses and had then removed to Western Reserve, where he had erected an iron works and failed. Being one day in Amity, I noticed that Reddick McKee, then a lad employed in keeping store for Mr. Jelly, was reading Virgil. Inquiring who was his teacher, he said, Mr. Spalding. Sometime after his death, an old Yankee man by the name of Hubble, who went about selling wooden bowls, told me that he had known him in the state of New York and had often heard him preach, and also called him Esquire Spalding. It is probable that he was a Congregationalist, and it is likely that not ordained while at Amity, editors write, as that denomination only gives licenses which expire by their own limitation in time. That's a That's the time. So that there is no evidence of his being deposed for immorality. The few scraps of writing above mentioned were all that I knew anything about, till some years after his death, when the Mormons took their rise. Having received a letter of inquiry on the subject from some person in the state of Ohio, I found that Mr. Spalding had been more communicative to some other persons, and that Mr. John Thompson and J. Van Seaman had read his novel or some parts of it. Seaman was then dead. I inquired of Mr. Thompson. He could not give much account of it, but said that he remembered the names of Neri and Lehi, which he understood were used in the Mormon Bible. I was referred to Miss Sarah Thompson, now Mrs. Day. She had read some of his writings, but not the one in question. I have understood Mr. Spalding has submitted his manuscript to Reverend Robert Patterson of Pittsburgh, who was connected in a printing office and bookstore with a view of having it published. And of course, that must have been before he came to Amity, as he still had it, the manuscript here. Mrs. Spalding went after his death to New York State, and I suppose carried the manuscript with her, and that being in the neighborhood where Joseph Smith resided, is by some means fell into his hands. Such, I think, has been the impression of Mrs. Spalding, though she knows not how he obtained it. You will thus perceive that I have no personal knowledge that would have any bearing on the subject, as I have never seen either the manuscript or the Mormon Bible. My impression, however, is of little consequence. I have no doubt that Spalding's novel was used by Joe Smith, but it was only used as a kind of substratum and did not contain anything of the essence of the Mormon faith. All of it that is contained is pretended revelations made to him and his successors and added afterwards. I do not suppose that any testimony that could be offered in this case would convince a Mormon of his error, and Congress will not undertake to decide as to the truth or falsehood of any religion, nor does it belong within their province. Respectfully yours, Cephas Dodd. And then it says George French wrote this. Reverend Cephas Dodd, who died January 16th, 1858, was long the pastor of the Presbyterian Church at Amity. He also practiced as a physician. In this capacity, attended Mr. Spalding in his last illness. Of his testimony, Mr. George French, now in his 83rd year, resided near Amity, and whose wife was a relative of Sidney Rigdon, retains a vivid impression. Shortly after Mr. French's removal from Fayette County, Pennsylvania, to Amity in 1832, when the Mormon delusion was beginning to excite remark, Dr. Dodd took Mr. French to Spalding's grave and there told him his positive belief that Rigdon was the agent in transforming Spalding's manuscript into the Book of Mormon. The conviction thus expressed within 2 years after the publication of the Book of Mormon and 3 years before the appearance of Mr. Howe's book, which attributed the plagiarism to Rigdon, shows that Dr. Dodd's judgment was formed independently of any of the testimonies cited above. As to the plagiarism, it must have been based on his own knowledge of Spalding's romance and comparing it with the Book of Mormon, and as to the agent, his attention, like Mr. Miller's, may first have been directed to Rigdon by Spalding himself. Mr. French has no personal knowledge of Rigdon's connection with the printing office. So that's secondhand testimony from George French from Cephas Dodd. And then we have this. Mr. Editor, I was reading quite lately in the papers the repeated story of the origin of the Book of Mormon. I have long believed it was substantially true. It is said it was written by one Solomon Spalding, a disabled or retired congregational minister, as a sort of romance founded on the evidence afforded that our country has once been inhabited by a race of people more civilized and distinct from the Indian tribes found on its discovery by Columbus. It being a popular theory about that time, these were the lost tribes of Israel and the probable mound builders. This manuscript is said either before or after Mr. Spalding's death was taken to printing office at Pittsburgh, where Sidney Rigdon got hold of it, and with Joseph Smith and others published as found in a miraculous manner in Palmyra, New York. This Mr. Spalding is said lived at an early day at Conduit and had a forged or trip hammer in the valley on the creek. This was confirmed by the present writer some years ago by the late Colonel Robert Hopper of Hoppersfield. He said when a young man he spent some time at Conduit and well remembered Mr. Spalding and his wife. He spoke of him as somewhat singular, living in a long, low, shanty-like building of boards. In one end was his forge, while in the other he lived with his wife, and kept a kind of grocery store. He said in common with other young men, he often spent his evenings there. He distinctly remembered one night they had been playing cards for amusement. When about to leave, he needed something to wrap up his cards, when Mrs. Spalding brought to him a leaf of some manuscript. Upon making some remark about the propriety of his using it, she remarked it was only a piece of the doctor's novel. This led him to ask if her husband was writing a novel, and when she said yes, upon the first inhabitants who lived upon this continent, and upon examination he found this to be the character of the scrap of the manuscript she had given him. All this in connection with what has been published before, and the fact of such remarkable remains in the neighborhood of Conduit leads to the probable conclusion that Solomon Spalding wrote the Book of Mormon, substance at least, and probably while living at Conduit. I have written in the hope that there were persons still living at Conduit or in the vicinity that knew Mr. Spalding who could confirm the above, and more than this, can affirm they knew Mr. Spalding to be the author of the book, and such as it is. If there are any such persons, I think it would be promotive of the truth to publish it. At least it would serve to preserve and establish a historical fact. Therefore, I am prompted to ask that all such communications shall appear in your columns or in the Conduit paper, from which no doubt you would cheerfully copy, hoping that both the editor of the Telegraph and Conduit reporter will feel an interest in the matter. I'm yours truly. So this is secondhand. That Hollis got this from Robert Harper. It might show that Spalding. This is very interesting, but this might support the idea that Spalding had laid aside that first manuscript because now he's letting it being used as scrap paper, and so that's a possibility there. And then we have Daniel Spencer. So Daniel Spencer said, a correspondent of the Ashtabula Telegraph, writing from Greencastle, Indiana, says in support of the belief that one Solomon Spalding, who once lived in Conduit, was the author of the Book of Mormon, that the late Colonel Robert Harper, when a young man, was frequently at the said Spalding's in Conduit, that Harper told him, the correspondent, that he, Harper, had seen a page of manuscript omitted by Spalding's wife to have been written by him, remarking farther that her husband was engaged upon a novel, the subject of which was the first inhabitants of this continent, etc. Correspondent seeks further information upon this subject. Not long after the appearance of the Book of Mormon, Dr. Daniel Spencer, a resident of Kingsville, in a conversation of our hearing and at our father's house in this town, said that he was well acquainted with Spalding when he lived in Conduit, had been at his house often and had read manuscripts written by Spalding, that the matter contained in said manuscript was touching the lost tribes of Israel, their wanderings and final settlement on this continent, that he saw and read the pages of Spalding's fanciful writings at different times and read much of them. He declared not only the subject matter of Spalding's novel was incorporated in the Book of Mormon, but much of it was a literal transcript to the best of his knowledge after reading the contents of both. His declarations were made when Mormonism first made its monstrous pretensions, when the public mind was stirred upon the subject, and they made a very formidable impression upon our mind. Dr. Spencer had a decided taste for antiquarian research and speculation, and those who knew him will not wonder that he was interested in Spalding's vagaries about the lost tribes, mound builders, etc. As the correspondent suggests, some of the older citizens of Conduit must have some knowledge upon the subject not yet made public. Now, it's interesting he lived in Kingsville, and if you remember, we talked about Orson Hyde and how he had written down in his diary that he had been to Kingsville, and then he went up eventually to Conduit. So we take his testimony for what it's worth. And then there's William Leffingwell in 1885. The Venerable Leffingwell, Colonel Leffingwell, accompanied by an old Mormon friend from Utah, was met by a Republican reporter yesterday afternoon on Olive Street. The Colonel's friend remarked to the reporter, "Did you know that Leffingwell corrected the manuscript of the Mormon Bible alleged to have been written by Reverend Solomon Spalding?" This was something like a new revelation on Colonel Leffingwell, stating that it was a fact, and as all parties knowing the circumstances are now dead, except Mr. Leffingwell, he was asked to add to the truth of history by telling what he knew about the origin of the Mormon Bible. The Colonel readily consented, but his Mormon friend observing his readiness to do so, walked on and beckoned to the Colonel to come along, evidently objecting to having this story told for publication. Colonel Leffingwell commenced by saying, "Long ago in the past, I have forgotten the year, Mr. Spalding wrote a drama called The Book of Mormon, in a hotel at Conneaut, Ashtabula County, Ohio, where I had been teaching school. I was known through the country as a good grammarian and possessing an accurate knowledge of the English language. My father had been principal of the Meadville School at Meadville, Pennsylvania for 8 years, a position which I subsequently filled on my father retiring to a farm. Mr. Spalding was a lawyer by profession and had taught school. He had never been a reverend, at some accounts give that prefix to his name. He was about 35 years of age when I first fell in with him, and was very poor and sick with consumption. Toward the last, nearly lost his voice so that he could not plead at the bar. He said he wanted to make some money, wrote the drama, which he handed me for correction. It was full of Bible expressions, and as I read the Bible from lid to lid, I knew the proper phraseology to use. I corrected the grammar and had to reconstruct and transpose entries to make good English out of it. I was engaged 3 months, and my notes and pencil marks may be found on every page. Never paid for it. He wanted to conform to Bible language. He never paid me a cent for my labor. It was entitled The Book of Mormon. He told me he was going to Pittsburgh to sell the manuscript. I afterwards learned that he got hold of Sidney Rigdon, and I knew within 6 months that Spalding sold it and that Rigdon got it. Rigdon was a preacher in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. He was wrong about that. He was a scholar and a smart fellow. I've seen him baptizing converts in Mahoning County, Ohio. Some years after I was on a lecture tour in Ohio lecturing on grammar and the construction of English language. I went to Kirtland in a buggy accompanied by a young lawyer to see Joe Smith and the Mormon leaders. We drove up in front of a large tent and Sidney Rigdon came out. I told him that I corrected the Mormon Bible when it was Spalding's manuscript. I assured him I gave it the proper construction and what grammar it had. He smiled and said that was all right, but requested me to say nothing about it. I told Rigdon that we came over there to see him and Joe Smith. He said, it's just our dinner time. You can't see Joe Smith because he's marking goods at the store. They have received 40 wagon loads from the lake shore the day before. Afterwards, we were introduced to the prophet. Joseph Smith had a round face and his hair was cut short down on his forehead. The color of his hair was between a deep brown and a dark red. He sent a young man with us into the temple, which was but newly finished. The front had a projecting roof supported by pillars. We entered the portico when the young man, our guide, said, take off your hats. I replied, our hats are already off, sir. We have a long ways to drive and we want you to hurry up, sir. The temple divided. We were then conducted into the interior of the temple. A broad aisle ran through the middle of the temple with a cross aisle in the center, above which a curtain hung, dividing the temple into 2 parts. Sidney Rigdon occupying, we were told, the eastern portion and Joe Smith the western portion, which included the grand altar. The arrangement seemed to be thus made in consequence of the incomplete conditions of the temple. By mounting on one another's shoulders, we were enabled to pull ourselves through a hole in the attic where we were shown several mummies, including that of Joseph and other patriarchs mentioned in the Bible. After visiting the temple, we were invited into the tent where we were provided with a good dinner, and taking leave of the saints, we drove out of Kirtland, well satisfied with our visit. The above chat with Livingwell left the impression that his statement of the part taken by him in the correction of Spalding's manuscript is undeniable. But the other fact that said manuscript was original of the Mormon Bible is rather a matter of inference than supported by direct and incontrovertible testimony. Curran Leffingwell, however, asserts that so far he has compared his recollections of the Spalding manuscript with the Mormon Bible. They are identical. That is his belief. Now, Broadhurst, I think his notes are very important here because there are some mistakes made here. L.L. Rice recalled Leffingwell as being a well-known teacher in northern Ohio. March 4th, 1886 letter in Honolulu newspaper to a Honolulu newspaper. And if he did assist at a hotel in Conneaut, then it must have been Henry Lake's mansion house, which most likely dates to the second half of 1812. His memory does not serve him well in the layout of the Kirtland Temple, Smith's appearance, Rigdon's connection to the Presbyterians. So that's why we got to be careful with his testimony. So it seems like we do have a strong case with all the witnesses, but we got to bring to also the ones that seem to be contradictory or very weak. So let me mention Daniel Spalding, who is related to Solomon Spalding. He was his nephew. And Daniel says this: what is your given name, Mr. Spalding? Daniel D. Spalding. How old are you? I'm 82 years old. How long have you lived in this vicinity? About 60 years. How closely were you related to Solomon Spalding? He was my father's brother. How old were you this last time you saw your uncle? Between 10 and 11 years of age. Then you remember him well? Oh, yes, he was a very sickly man. The last time I saw him, he was at Conneaut Creek just before he went to Pittsburgh, where he died shortly afterwards. What did your uncle do for a living? He was a land agent. My father said he was a scoundrel and used to cheat the people out of their money and property. Was he much of a scholar? No, he had some natural talent, but he was not very smart. but very lazy. Then he wrote the manuscript that the Mormons call the Book of Mormon to make money out of it. How did the Mormons get the manuscripts? I don't know. Here, his daughter, a lady about 50 years, replied his widow gave them to Joseph Smith Jr. Is there not a story afloat that Sidney Rigdon stole them? I had not heard that before. Mr. Spalding, did you ever see the manuscripts or the Book of Mormon? No. What did Mr. Spalding write about? I heard my father say it was a story about the Indians. Was your uncle a minister? He was not, neither did he belong to any church. Then you do not know whether the Book of Mormon and the manuscript are the same or not. No, only that what I've heard people say, have not seen either. So Broadhurst, I think on his website, gives the weakness of his testimony. Last time he saw his uncle, he said he was between 10 and 11, which would be in 1817, but Spalding would have died in 1816. And number two, he says he saw him just before he went to Pittsburgh, which would make it 1812, and that would make him around 5 years old. And then Del Broadhurst says he was a son of Solomon Spalding's younger brother Solomon Spalding and his wife Martha. In 1810, he moved with his father's family from Connecticut to the Ohio-Pennsylvania border, just south of the shore of Lake Erie. In about 1842, John Spalding and his family moved to Illinois, leaving behind in Crawford County, Pennsylvania, only Daniel Spalding, his wife, and 3 children. The following entry is found on page 837 in the history of Crawford County, Pennsylvania. Daniel D. Spalding was born in Oxford County, Connecticut, October 3rd, 1807, son of John and Martha Spalding. John Spalding was an educated man, a school teacher, also a singing teacher in the early day in Connecticut. He was a brother of Solomon Spalding, who is asserted wrote a religious tale corresponding with Joseph Smith's, the founder of Mormonism, Book of Mormon, entitled The Manuscript Found. After Spalding's death, the manuscript fell into the hands of one Sidney Rigdon, an intimate acquaintance of Joseph Smith. Our subject's mother, while living in Springfield Township, Erie County, Pennsylvania, was attacked by Indians in her home, but she managed to escape into the woods with her 4 small children, leaving the Indians to pillage the house. Daniel D. Spalding came to this county in 1817, settled in Conneaut Township, where there were only 3 houses by the road. Between his place and Conneautville, he took up 75 acres of land, which he cleared, and at one time he owned 175 acres, all of which he accumulated by hard work and industry. Mr. Spalding was married in 1832 to Miss Alethea Whaley, a native of Schuyler, Herkimer County, New York, and daughter of Thomas Whaley, who came to Crawford County in 1817, settling in Conneaut Township. He was a soldier in the War of 1812, a shoemaker and farmer. To Mr. and Mrs. Spalding were born 3 children, 2 now living, Mrs. Eunice A. Barnum and Lemuel D. Our subject is a member of no church, although brought up a Baptist. Note 2, this is what Broadhurst says. The most questionable part of Daniel's statement is the part where he says he saw his uncle last. Solomon Spalding, where Solomon was between 10 and 11 years of age. This would have been in 1817. However, Solomon Spalding died in 1816. More reasonable is Daniel saying that the last time he saw his uncle was just before he went to Pittsburgh. This was the fall of 1812, when Spalding was barely 5 years old. Daniel's latest recollections of his uncle Solomon would have been those of a young child. At that time, Solomon Spalding was indeed a land agent, and sales promotions may have involved more sharp Yankee trading than the trustworthy dealings of an honest clergyman. In fact, Solomon Spalding probably never admitted to being in the clergy after he was removed from his position at headmaster of the Cherry Valley Academy just prior to the year 1800. The licenses for unordained congregational and Presbyterian preachers expired in time, and Spalding probably never took the trouble to renew his. All in all, Daniel D. Spalding's statement furnishes practically no useful information about Solomon Spalding and his writings. And then we have Josiah Spalding, another brother of Solomon Spalding, and this is what he says. I received your letter from the 21st of December requesting me to give you a sketch of my brother Solomon's life. I should be pleased to oblige you satisfactorily, but my recollection and faculty of mind is so much impaired with age and infirmity, being within 2 months of 90 years of age. I can give but a broken narrative. He was born 1761 in the first part of the Revolutionary War. He was in the army or at work on the farm. I do not recollect when he commenced study for education at high school, nor how long he continued there. But when he left there, he went to study with the celebrated Zephaniah Swift to prepare for the practice of law. How long he studied with him, I do not recollect. Before he got through, his mind changed from law to gospel, and he left, went to college. But when I do not really recollect, I believe he was in college about 3 years. He did not study theology at any public school after he left college. And when he left college, he was out of health, was so for years. He was approbated to preach as a Congregationalist and followed that calling a number of years, but never settled on account of his health, though often urged. In 1795, he married. I went to Cherry Valley and commenced merchandising. I had no wife. He followed soon after with his wife and joined me in partnership. He left the store to my care. He took the charge of an academy, preached occasionally for a while. We continued in Cherry Valley for about 4 years, and then we moved our store 16 miles to Richfield. We soon after went into a large speculation in new land in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And after a few years, he moved out there with his wife. She never had any children. He sold a large amount of land on credit, principally to people in Ohio. The war that broke out with England seriously affected that country. That circumstance, with some other misfortunes that happened, placed us in difficult circumstances. We were under the necessity to make great sacrifices to pay our debts. I went to see my brother and stayed with him some time. I found him unwell, somewhat low in spirits. He began to compose his novel, which is conjectured that the Mormons made use of in forming their Bible. Indeed, although there was nothing in it, Mormonism, although there's nothing in it, Mormonism or that favored error in any way, yet I am apprehensive that they took pattern from it in forming their delusion. You may find my reason in what follows. In the town where he lived, which I expect is now called Salem, Ohio, there is the appearance of an ancient fort, and nearby a large mound, which when opened was found to contain human bones. These things gave it the appearance of its being inhabited by a civilized people. These appearances furnished a topic of conversation among the people. My brother told me that a young man told him that he had a wonderful dream. He dreamed that he himself, if I recollect right, opened a great mound where there were human bones. That there he found a written history that would answer the inquiry respecting the civilized people that once inhabited that country until they were destroyed by the savages. This story, he suggests the idea of writing in a novel merely for amusement, which would be the first manuscript. The title of his novel, I think, was Historical Novel or Manuscript Found. This novel is a history that contained in the manuscript found. The author of it he brings from the old world, but from what nation I do not recollect. I think not a Jew, nor do I recollect how long since, but I think before the Christian era. He was a man of superior learning suited to that day. He went to sea, lost his point of compass, finally landed on the American shore, I think near the mouth of the Mississippi River. There he reflects most feelingly on what he suffered, his present condition, and future prospects. He likewise makes some lengthy remarks on astronomy and philosophy, which I think would agree in sentiment and style with very ancient writings. He soon after moved to Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, where he lived a while, and then moved farther to a place where he died. His widow then returned to the state of New York and lived there a while, and then came to Connecticut. She informed me, if I recollect right, that my brother continued his history of the civilized nation and the progress of the war until the triumph of the savages to the destruction of the civilized government. Likewise, she informed me that soon after they arrived at Pittsburgh, a man followed them. I do not recollect his name, but he was afterwards known to be a leading Mormon. He got into the employment of a printer, and he told the printer about my brother's composition. The printer called and requested the privilege of taking it home to read. He and my brother let him take it. He kept it some time, and then he urged him and my brother to let him print it. He and my brother would not consent, but took it back, and she said that she brought it to New York, put it into a chest where she lived. And at a time when she was from home, a stranger called upon her and requested her to let him see the novel that her husband composed. He said that he lived in the West, and it was reported there that it gave rise to Mormonism. If not true, he wished to counteract the report. She told him that he might go to the house. It was in the chest. He might take it and examine it. He went to the chest, and I think she told me that he said that he could not find it, but it has never been found since. But what use could they make of it? I never saw the Mormon Bible but once, and then only for a minute, no time to examine it. I have but little knowledge of Mormonism. I have been out of the way of it. You, sir, no doubt have more knowledge, but if I have been rightly informed, there is a striking resemblance between the first start and introduction of the Mormon Bible and my brother's novel. They both claim that the manuscripts from which they pretend they copied were of very ancient date, written by men that came here and from the old world. The Mormon Bible was not published until after my brother's death. Yours respectively, Josiah Spalding. So what we see here is, I think we see some mix-up of details because of the older age of Mr. Josiah, but we see that he remembered the first story, manuscript story. Okay, so we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up with the next set of witnesses. Really appreciate you being with us, and we thank you so much.